Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today I want to talk about growing more in the space that you have with multi-sowing. And, sometimes you find out that how you grow a garden is now new or exciting, or there's a fancy new name for the method that you use. And this is kind of what happened to me because I stumbled across this multi-sowing method. I was watching an English YouTuber building an off-grid homestead, and he had a pretty neat setup with like hydroelectric as well as solar power and stuff. And the house they were building looked a little bit like one of the Hobbit houses and stuff, and that was kind of cool. And he had like these onions growing in clusters, so there was like 3 or 4 onions all growing together in a bigger patch of onions that were growing, and he was just kind of twisting out one of the onions and pulling one to harvest them. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. And as it turns out, there's lots of other plants that work well with this method of growing as well, and some I already actually grow this way using this multi-sowing or cluster method, but others like the onions I had never even thought about. So that's one of the wonderful things about technology and being able to see things on YouTube and stuff today is you get inspired to try something new. And since moving out here to beautiful Maine, I get to start a whole new garden again, and I love growing intensive gardens that produce reliably and use what's already on the property to help the garden and the homestead flourish without needing, external inputs. And using this gardening method of multi-sowing or cluster growing, it's going to be great if you have, a lot of space to grow, or even if you have a small space to grow, like just a small raised bed. And this kind of growing method works really well in no-till gardens and gardens that are converting to intensive production. So if you're thinking about starting a garden or you want to get more from your garden, then, cluster growing or multi-sowing, whichever way you want to call it, might be, a good option for you. And if you're a busy gardener, you're short on space in your garden, there's some really great reasons to try this growing method. Number one is that it is space saving. You can grow more plants in the same area. Reason number two is it's a better more efficient use of resources, right? You're using less seed starting mix to start more plants. You're using, seed starting trays and modules better because you're able to grow more plants in those. You're able to use light or space for seed starting more effectively for the number of plants. It's also a great time saver, and that's reason number 3, because you're planting more plants or you're sowing more seed in the same time for doing one. And number 4 is that you get a extension of harvest, so you're able to pick plants over a few weeks or a few days rather than all at once, which is really great if you are super busy and you don't want to be overrun with a bunch of plants all at once. Now, Dallas Dowding, who uses this method in his no-till garden. If you've never heard of him, he is a very well-known organic gardener from the UK, and he has been growing using no-till, like no digging methods of cultivation to grow organically for a number of years. And he uses this multi-sowing technique, and he observes that plants growing much better due to, he calls it a companion effect. Like the seedlings and the plants like to grow together and right next to each other, and it helps them grow better than if they were planted out singularly. Now, for some plants, like beets or Swiss chard, their seeds are naturally, multiple seeds in a cluster. So if you ever looked at a Swiss chard or a beet seed, they are multiple plant seeds kind of already fused together. And that makes them a really great candidate to try for an easy vegetable to grow using this cluster growing method. But it works on lots of different plants. But I should probably talk about what is multi-sowing, right? I've got this far in the podcast. You're like, what the heck is multi-sowing? So multi-sowing is basically sowing a number of seeds in the same hole in the garden or in the seed starting tray module as you would put one seed, right? That sounds, really basic, right? But this is kind of how I was taught to grow. So in my garden, and years and years and years ago, when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, my granddad taught me how to grow runner beans. And he always said, there's one seed for me, 2 seeds for the slugs. So I would plant 3 seeds in that same hole. Sometimes all 3 make it, sometimes 1, maybe 2, even no seeds make it, and that's okay. That's part of experimenting in the garden to find out what works for you and for your garden. Now, where we grew up, 3 seemed to be the magic number of seeds, but, I've had to do multi-sowing when I lived in Utah, and it could be up to 5 seeds I was growing and maybe 1 would make it. So there's differences in where you live, and there's a good rule of thumb, which is usually 3 to 5 seeds seems to be the magic number. And then as plants start to get a little bigger, you want to thin out and remove the weakest plant. You can just do that with a pair of scissors, where you chop the leaves off right at or you cut the stem right off at soil level, and then it allows the other plants to have space to grow, because it's important that they still have space to grow. Now let's talk about some vegetables that grow well using this gardening method. And I've had some plants that have grown really quite successfully for me using this cluster growing. And those have been beets, Swiss chard for salads, not for the big braising greens. If you want big leaves for braising or, stewing down or whatever, then you need to plant those in the single spacing so they have room to grow and get big, right? I really quite like Swiss chard that has leaves big enough that I can use as an umbrella in a downpour. Runner beans, they've worked very well. Leeks have also worked very well. I love growing leeks. I think they're great for small space and being able to get that oniony hit. Peas, salad mixes, again for small salad leaves, not for the bigger heading type of lettuces. Spinach for small leaves works very well with this, as do pole beans, and I've even done winter squash using this method to be able to grow more winter squash vines in a smaller space. But there's a bunch of other vegetables and herbs that work well using this cluster growing, and those include basil, dill, chervil, which is kind of an aniseedy type of herb. It's pretty abundant in my new garden here in Maine, which is exciting. I need some recipes for it. So if you know different recipes or ways to use chervil in the garden, then please drop me a note on the Facebook group. I'd love to hear more. Cilantro or coriander work well with cluster growing, as does parsley, kale, onions, radish, arugula or rocket, and turnips. And I mentioned earlier that even though you are sowing seeds together in the same hole, you still need to give plants space to grow between the clusters. So let's say your leeks need 6 to 8 inches between the plants, then you would look to plant your seedlings or sow your clusters about 6 to 8 inches apart from each other. And if you are planting out seedlings, you can put multiple sown seeds in a module in a seed tray, and you just pop them on like you would normal. So if you're starting them in the smaller plugs, you would then want to kind of transplant those earlier into a bigger growing space so they've got room to move. Other ways to do it are to have a seed tray where you can just kind of grow or sow the seeds wherever they're not in a module, and then you would prick them out. So you would carefully lift out the seedlings and then put them into a bigger container to grow. And some of them can stay, as a cluster. That's okay. Or you could put multiple plants together. I find it's easier to do it with seed and put them in a cluster together and then just transplant them as a cluster. Or unless it's a bigger seed like peas or beans, those things that need to be planted directly in the garden. And then I just put, 3 seeds, 4 seeds, even 5 seeds together in the garden and then have them all grow together. Let's talk about harvesting because when you're harvesting from this method, it's a little bit different. So you pick the biggest plant first and then you leave the smaller plants in place. So this is especially true for the root vegetables, right? You just kind of twist out the bigger plant, and this gives you gives your smaller plants a chance to get more sunshine, more nutrients, and grow a little bit bigger over the next few days, even a week or so for some veggies. And then again, you can come back to that same spot. You can pick the bigger plant again from that cluster, and you can carry that on, leave the last one to grow a little bit more, and then come back and then finally pick that bigger plant. And this repeated harvesting is really great for homesteaders that are wanting to really supplement their food from the garden without getting overwhelmed with a glut of produce ready all at the same time, right? I mean, hands up, let me know in the Facebook group if you've been overrun with zucchini. I don't know a gardener that hasn't. Although if you've never been overrun by zucchini, I think you're lucky. I hear all the time of people that are overrun with zucchini and would be leaving them around the neighborhood. And, we were chatting with our new neighbor last night, and he was telling me how he used to grow a lot of string beans, and he got so overrun with them, he was leaving them on neighbors' doorsteps and things. So, this kind of harvesting method works better for some people than others, and I think there's a great opportunity for you to play about and experiment a little with this in your garden. Now, for things like pole beans and winter squashes, you would harvest those in the normal way. You don't need to be pulling up the whole plant for a harvest like you would for a beet, for example. But being able to sow a number of plants together means that you've got a better opportunity for things like pollination, which is going to increase your yield of plants. Kale leaves or salad leaves, you would just cut the outer larger leaves and let the plant keep growing. So you can just kind of pick out those bigger leaves every few days, and that plant's going to keep growing, and you're going to be able to get multiple harvests from that same space. So I would love to know from you over in the Facebook group, do you grow using the cluster growing or the multi-sowing method? Let me know. I would love to see pictures of what you've grown. I'd love to see how everybody's garden's growing. And until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I will see you all next week.